What's up, YouTube? So I want to come through and talk about the true, dark, sinister purpose of the biracial in the system of white supremacy. All right. All right. Before I get into this, though, I'm going to give a disclaimer. So here it is. I have no hate or ill will towards the collective of mixed and biracial people. Of course, mixed and biracial meaning part black. All right. As well, I don't really have any hate or ill will towards anybody, but you know what I mean. This is about the ones that are mixed with who are part black, of course. I don't automatically dismiss them from blackness. Me personally, I don't. Unless they dismiss themselves from blackness. Then at that point, I'm not going to be arguing to try and include you into blackness when you don't want to be included. Right? And honestly, I don't care if you are like the darkest, most West African king or queen or whatever. If you don't claim blackness, I'm not going to claim it for you. All right. As well, I have no beef with swirlers by and large. As long as they ain't on coon shit, then I don't really have a beef. But don't get it twisted. I will say what I have to say, but there's no beef. It's just me, speaking my piece about the situation. All right. And also, this is a theory what I'm going to be talking about. So take it with a grain of salt. Don't be just taking it to be extremely literal, by the way, and being in your feelings about it, like some of you motherfuckers be. All right. But with that disclaimer being said, let's get started. All right. So this, sort of like the origins of the biracial, kind of pretty much came from the plantation, at least in the Americas. I don't know about other places, but we in the United States, so that's what we're going to talk about, all right? So this started on the plantation with, whites, male slave owners, or white slave owners raping, black African women, okay? So these KBs raping these African women, and the product of this rape was the mulatto, or as we know the mulatto today, the biracial, okay? So we kind of have, so there's like this new population now, right? And, white folks are kind of like, well, what do we do with this new population? All right. So they were like, okay, let's, make them slaves too, and as well, that kind of helps to increase the slave population and to protect, you know, whiteness and also their status within the system. Okay. Of course, there was a distinction made between the mulatto slaves and the African slaves, right? The light-skinned slave and the dark-skinned slave, right? Of course, there was a distinction, right? Because it's kind of like them creating somewhat of a caste system in a way. Although I think sometimes white people kind of go by this system and sometimes they don't go by this system. Like sometimes they will, sometimes they won't. It's just kind of like seemingly random, you know. But yeah, there was a differentiation made between the light skin and the dark skinned slaves, thus kind of like the origins of colorism in a way. Their presence on the plantation and later in the black community, especially the biracial females, perpetuates colorism, right? Thus causing confusion and division within the community, right? So that's part of the role of the biracial, right? To cause confusion and division amongst black people, right? Another thing, they sustain the white population, or they help to sustain the white population by procreating with them, especially the biracial males, right? But of course, biracials have the potential to sustain and perpetuate blackness too, of course, right? The theory with this is that white genetics, and this is a theory, by the way, The theory is that white genetics are too weak to sustain themselves. I personally don't completely buy that, but that is the theory. Besides, we know how robust black genetics are, and they do too. As quiet as it's kept, they do too. They won't admit it, but they know. They know what's up. And honestly, if you want to see if you want proof of this, one, if you want like present day proof of this, a search on YouTube or Google the following phrase: BBC genetics. And it's not really about like, big black cock genetics, but it's really just about like kind of like black muscular, like athleticism genetics more so. Google that phrase and you'll see some non-black people of all groups kind of talking about that, you know. Also, another thing, historically speaking, remember during slavery how, African women would be forced to breastfeed white children? Why would they want someone who they considered subhuman, and even an animal, to breastfeed their children? You know, because they wanted some of them black genetics to rub off. Let's be real. They know what's up. They ain't gonna admit it, but they know what's up. Heck, even cow's milk. Why do we drink it? Generally speaking, we drink it for the nutritional value, the calcium, right? Also, I had meant to mention this earlier, but I'm going to jump back to that whole biracials being able to sustain whiteness and sustain blackness, having the potential to sustain both. And this is a bit of a sidebar, but I'm just going to throw this out here, okay? Some black people, especially black men, will say that their biracial children are with black people, right? Okay, but you don't get a fucking cookie for that. You don't get a fucking butter biscuit for that shit. If anything, you broke even. So you should just be thankful that your children cleaned up the mess that you made, okay? That's your fucking cookie. That's your butter biscuit. You don't get a fucking parade for that shit, though, because you could have had black kids who perpetuated blackness. You didn't have to have biracial kids to perpetuate blackness. And honestly, the black kids could have done it better. So again, no, you don't get no fucking cookie. You don't get no fucking butter biscuit. You don't get a fucking parade for that shit. And also, like, when we came into contact with Europeans, we weren't really affected by their pathogens, their diseases, like the Native American population was. Like when the Native American population came in contact with their pathogens, that was like a death sentence for them. But for black people, it wasn't that bad, you know. And as well, I want to mention that, when black people were, snatched up and taken from their homeland and forced to come to the Americas, they didn't bring with them any diseases, by the way, white people. They didn't bring any diseases with them, okay? That's just something I want to throw out there, too. So, for slavery, I think black people were a better option for slavery versus Native Americans because, one, Native Americans couldn't tolerate that whole European pathogens and diseases thing. Two, because Native Americans knew the layout of the land very well, so they could escape really well. Like, because they've lived on this land for centuries, if not millennia, you know. On the other hand, black people, African folks, They weren't affected by the European pathogens, and they didn't know the layout of the land. So unfortunately, our robust African genetics did play a role in us being here. You know, unfortunately, it kind of ended up being sort of like a perfect storm. You know, but this race mixing strategy, I don't think it's exclusive to black people. I think white people also use other racial groups too, like Native Americans, mestizos, Asians, etc. Um, but I'll pose a question for you guys though. Why would they perpetuate miscegenation on the slave plantation, then after slavery put the one-drop rule into law, outlaw interracial unions, then legalize them? Notice that there's a whole bunch of like weird stuff going on here. um, but yeah, that does sort of send like a whole bunch of mixed messages, though, right? But don't get it twisted. The system of white supremacy will sacrifice some of its own in order to survive and maintain itself. So white supremacy will sacrifice some white people for the greater good. Don't get it twisted. White people are not exempt from being a victim of white supremacy, by the way. But yes, because some of you probably like, well, why would white people want to kind of like promote race mixing? You know, because it kind of helps to maintain themselves. And that's the theory, and that's kind of like what I'm going to go with in this video. I know there's some people who can like counter that. There's some counter arguments to that, of course, especially some old school people who just be like, anything with a drop of black is black, I think the younger generation is more so kind of like, kind of pushing back against that. And also, I do think there's a difference between the biracials of yesteryear and the biracials of today. And I'll kind of get into that a little later in this video. All right. Well, I guess. All right. So next. All right. Notice the rise in the image and the identity of biracial people lately. Notice that. Notice lately that you've kind of been seeing biracial people kind of like on the rise. Why? Where did this come from? I'll give you the precise moment where this kind of popped off. Okay? It was the 2000 census. This is where this popped off at. And some of you are like, well, what's the big deal about the 2000 census? Well, I'll explain. The 2000 census was the first census in decades that biracial people of all races, not just the black ones, were able to specifically identify themselves. And that hasn't happened in a long time, right? And this really came about because of, in the 80s, white mothers of biracial children were advocating for the mixed and biracial category to classify their offspring and their kids with. They wanted that category for their children. Black leaders were against it because they felt like it would weaken the black community's political power. Sidebar, where were the black fathers when this was happening, when these white women were advocating for the mixed and biracial category and this shit? Because some of these same Negroes love to claim that their children are just so pro-black and, do everything black, sleep black, eat black, talk black, walk black, drive their car black, whatever, So where were these Negroes at? Where were these nignogs at when this shit was happening? All right. And they love to be saying this, you the seed of your father, right? They love that shit. The black gene is dominant, right? But also notice that the trend now is biracials who have black dads and white moms. Notice that. And honestly, this works out even better for the system of white supremacy. This really does, because it compromises the protectors and patriarchs of the black race and community. Okay? So they, oh yeah, white supremacy will sacrifice some of, their, bottom shelf white women, to do something like that. Oh sure, that's the part of their strategy now. Don't get it twisted. You thinking that old Bubba and Ricky Bobby and who Larry the Cable Guy or whatever the fuck, you know, you see them and they're mad and no daughter of mine is gonna be with some damn jigaboo. I ain't gonna have no damn jigaboo, half jigaboo grandchildren running around my goddamn yard. What the hell would the neighbors think? Right? And that is a factor, but the powers that be, they kind of know what they're doing, all right, So they'll let, Bubba and Larry the Cable Guy and Ricky Bobby be upset, It really kind of just, it's low key, it kind of helps push the narrative, it helps pushes interracial dating because, they want to piss off Bubba. Some of these black dudes really be thinking that, and some of these white chicks want to be pissing off their dads for some reason. I don't know. I don't know. But also, keep in mind that we are in the middle of a shift in racial identity and classification right now. This is not the first time that this has happened, by the way. This is just another instance of this, right? Because, of course, we know about the one drop rule, right? Where that kind of shifted the racial classification system and it removed, mulatto, quadroon, octoroon, etc. It removed those categories and it just was like colored or Negro instead, But also, even amongst white people, remember, there was a shift in racial classification too that involved white people. Because before, back a while ago, Irish people, Italian people, Jewish people, and other groups of people were not considered white. They weren't allowed into whiteness, right? But because whiteness had to maintain itself and it kind of was losing its ground, so it was like, okay, let's let them in. Let's let them in the system, right? In order to maintain itself, right? So you saw a shift in racial classification, right? And right now we're in the middle of a shift in racial classification right now. And of course, before I go, I just want to say, to be fair, not all biracials participate in this, of course. Of course not. Some do fight on the side of blackness. Some do, feel themselves as being black and, lend themselves to blackness and black causes. And, that's kind of like where their loyalties lie. And it's also, there's a factor of how you were raised too. I think that is a factor. Where it was like, if you were a biracial who was raised like majority around your black side and you didn't really have much to do with your white side for whatever reason, then I do think there's a difference between that biracial and a biracial who was raised primarily by their white side and didn't have much to do with their black side. Because I have seen some biracials kind of like that, where it was like they didn't have much to do with like their black side, and they kind of can, with me talking with them, I can kind of sense somewhat of like an anti-black undertone, And to be fair, I have called it out. Kind of like, when I was speaking to this person, kind of like, it kind of seems like you may have like maybe a bias or some sort of anti-black bias for some reason. Although they denied it, they denied it, but, I'm just saying though, right? So, I think I'm said all I have to say. I don't know what else to say here. So what do you guys think? Let me know in the comment section. Until the next video, adios and goodbye for now.